Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Brussels Sprouts Live. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
Nicholas Locker.
And we're so glad you can join us. Today, Nick is jumping in as your Brussels Sprouts co-host because we're celebrating the release of a new CNAS policy memo called Exploiting Russian Weakness, Leaning in to support the pro-Western orientation of Moldova and Georgia. It's timely because later this month, both Moldova and Georgia will hold crucial elections with the potential to profoundly shape their futures. As Russia attempts to reassert dominance along its periphery amid its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin's actions have triggered different geopolitical reorientations in different countries across the region. Moldova and Georgia illustrate this two-directional trend. While the Georgian government has signaled more alignment with Russia, Moldova is strengthening its ties with the West. However, these shifts may not be final, and the elections this October could shape their future trajectories. Given these stakes, Russia has already taken steps to interfere in these elections and could employ additional coercive tactics, threatening stability along NATO's eastern border in the future. Yet, this moment also presents an opportunity for the United States and the European Union. While the war in Ukraine continues, the transatlantic partners can take advantage of Russia's present weakness to rid the region of corrosive Russian influence and more firmly anchor Moldova and Georgia in the good governance, democracy, and economic prosperity that are the cornerstones of the Euro-Atlantic space. So to delve more deeply into all of these issues, we're really thrilled to have with us today both Laura Thornton and Dennis Chanusha with us today. Laura and Dennis, welcome to you both. Director of Global Democracy Programs at the McCain Institute, and she previously worked with the National Democratic Institute as Global Associate for Georgia and is just back from a trip to Georgia, which we're going to hear much more about. And Dennis is a political scientist from Moldova who works as the European Integration Program Director at the Expert Group, which is a think tank based in Chisinau. Okay, so I'm going to ask the same question of both of you, but Laura, you pick up the Georgia piece and Dennis, the Moldova piece. These elections are really critical. Tell us a little bit about what's at stake and why people need to be paying attention to these upcoming elections in Georgia, Laura, and in Moldova, Dennis.
So you'd like me to start with Georgia?
I would love for you to start with Georgia.
Let's go. So, well, obviously there's a lot at stake in the elections in Georgia, not from a lot of different perspectives. So I'm a democracy nerd. So I look at it with regard to just Georgia's own health of democracy. And we've seen over the last, actually several years, even when I was still living there, a precipitous decline, liberal reforms underway. And by the time I left, and I hope I'm not like a bad luck charm, but it was slowly eroding. And what I mean by that is reversing a lot of the liberal objectives that were starting to take hold after the transition from the Saakashvili regime. So things like, slowly trying to finally address those rule of law concerns and constitutional and judicial reforms, and then slowly reversing direction. So I'm concerned that Georgia's democracy isn't particularly healthy. We're heading into an election where you have a very unleveled playing field. You have widespread, incredible reports of abuse of state resources, of pressure on state employees. And remember, the majority of employed people in Georgia are employed by the state. This is a very effective tactic. And of course, a central election commission, which used to be regarded as quite professional and nonpartisan, even though it had partisan representation, and has now been pretty much hijacked by the ruling party. So I'm concerned about Georgia in that regard. But for the purposes of this discussion, I think we're concerned about Georgia's trajectory with regard to its foreign policy outlook. This election if it returns Georgian Dream to power, I think we'll see a continuation of a government moving its country away from its Western orientation, away from its traditional allies, towards a more comfortable relationship with Russia, more engagement with Russia, which we've already seen through resumed flights, through trade, through helping with sanctions evasions, through language. And if the opposition is successful and manages to coalesce, which is a big if, we would probably, according to what they've pledged, see that movement to sort of recommittal to EU, committed to NATO, implementing the reforms required to do that. So that means a lot to us. I think people are like, oh, Georgia, a small country, who cares? Well, this is the frontier. And if these dominoes continue to fall in the wrong direction, it has consequences for all of us. It has consequences for Black Sea security, and it has ripple effects. These countries affect one another. And that's why I think keeping our eye on Moldova and Georgia, and of course Armenia and others, really do indicate a trend and a trajectory in Europe and our overall security in the region.
Yeah, that's really great. We're going to come, you've obviously put a lot of the issues on the table, trajectory, how the election will go. We're going to come back to that. But this really is a little bit of a tale of two countries, because Moldova is moving rather in the other direction. And so this election is consequential for slightly different reasons. So Dennis, do you want to talk to us a little bit about the context in which this election will be taking place in Moldova? And again, like why Brussels Sprouts listeners should care about this election in a teeny country, but a strategically important country. So over to you, Dennis.
Thank you. I believe that Moldova is important for various reasons. Obviously, if we look at the region, we understand that the situation in Moldova will, to some extent, put some pressure on Ukraine, because if Moldova is run by pro-Russian forces or those who are promoting a very unclear, confused foreign policy, that would be not good for Ukraine, that needs somehow stability and sort of predictability when it comes to its neighbors, immediate neighbors. So in this regard, Moldova has to decide whether it will continue the current course towards the EU, or it will become a swing state, because this is exactly what is the risks when it comes to trajectory, right, of the foreign policy. And I think that even if Moldova has become a EU candidate state and is now discussing with the EU how to advance towards the opening of the accession talks and all this preparatory work, it is still right now in this kind of political complicated situation where it has to really test whether the population is supporting pro-EU forces, because in a way these elections are about the EU. Obviously, it's about foreign policy. These probably are the most geopolitical elections that Moldova has seen so far. But it's also about testing the confidence of the public in the current elites in the current ruling party, because we understand very well that probably Laura will mention that as well. The social economic issues are very much pressing. Moldovans are not judging the elections only through the lenses of where the country should move towards, but it's also about how people are living. The living standards are quite low. And therefore, I think that these elections are really about a bigger, larger picture. So in my view, Russia is going to use the social economic hardships that the country is going through, which are caused obviously by different reasons and by different crises. And we have the humanitarian crisis provoked by Russian aggression against Ukraine. We have the energy crisis, and then we have all these implications related to the inflation, which was up to 30%, and has obviously steal a lot of money from people's pockets. So I believe that these elections are really complex. In case of Moldova, they are presidential elections. We understand very well that the role of president is rather limited in this regard. Moldova it's still a parliamentary republic. but these elections will most likely have a big impact on the parliamentary election that will take place in the summer of the next year. So that is why we have to pay attention, because it's about security, but it's also about the entire, configuration of the EU enlargement towards the east.
Nick, I know you want to jump in, but Dennis, since you teased the parliamentary elections next year, which are quite consequential, do you want to just say a couple of words, tell it, the timing, and again, like what's at stake in those elections in particular?
Yeah, the stake is quite simple. At the moment, we have a majority of the ruling party that is supporting Maya Sandu in this presidential elections, and most likely, according to all surveys, this will not be possible next year. So we will have most likely a coalition government, which will create a little bit of instability depending on the cooperation between the parties that will be running the country. But what is important to understand is that if these elections will be lost by Maya Sandu and her party, then this most likely will propel to power pro-Russian political parties, as well as parties that have Eurosceptic discourse. This creates a lot of anxiety, especially in Brussels, because for them it's important to have reliable partners and political actors that are not changing their mind overnight. So I believe that next year the parliament will look quite different, and this will obviously create certain waves in the region, maybe including for Ukraine. I believe that Moldova might become, after parliamentary elections of next year, might become another Serbia, or if we look at the EU, another Hungary.
Yeah, so I mean, it's such an important point, because then, like, through political means and through election interference and other things, then Russia can manipulate the future trajectory of the country. The thing we can get into later is kind of, if Russia fails through the political means, what might be some other tools that they would turn to in order to advance those objectives. I definitely want to come back to that. But Nick, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. And thank you, Laura and Dennis, for really outlining the stakes of these elections. One thing, that I think it would be interesting to hear more about from you both is a little bit about where the public is in each of these countries on the question of foreign policy and, the future trajectory of their countries. Is Russia widely supported in Georgia and or Moldova? Is the population, very, very much in favor of closer alignment with the European Union and the West more broadly? And how important is that question of the country's foreign policy trajectory in these elections? Dennis, you mentioned that there's the presidential election in Moldova, but at the same time, there's going to be a referendum on enshrining EU integration in the constitution of Moldova on the same day. So that's obviously contributing to the importance of this vote overall. So curious to hear more about your sense of where the public is on these issues.
Yeah, sure. I think that that you pointed to one of the sensitivities of these elections. We know very well that Moldovan elections are already geopolitical. So on top of that, we also have a referendum about including European integration into the constitution, following somehow the example of Georgia and Ukraine. But what is also important for Moldova in this regard is that this referendum will be somehow simplifying the process of EU accession. It creates a lot of confusion, as well as speculations about the sovereignty and whether this referendum is going to open the door for transfer of sovereignty of Moldova towards the EU. And I think that is the place where the civil society organizations, as well as media, should play a bigger role in sense of explaining, as well as making sure that we are not moving in the wrong direction of understanding what are the costs and what are the limitations of the EU. But this is very important, because Russia is looking for all these mistakes. And I would like to mention a recent example when Mr. Majeks, is the ambassador of the EU to Moldova, has said clear regulations regarding the lands that should be or can be sold to EU citizens, because we speak about the movement of capital within the EU. And his statement was misinterpreted, including by the Russian pro-Russian media. So it was altered in such a way that both the EU and the government had to explain what actually that means. So all this talks about the referendum should be somehow lining towards helping the pro-EU forces to convince the population that they should be voted in order to keep the EU integration afloat. But this should come with a lot of strategic communication. And I think here the role of the EU partners as well as the US can do more for Moldova to help. But again, the last point that I would like to mention is that the society is, to a certain extent, is polarized. We have a quite significant segment of the population that is still looking towards the east. We speak about 35% of the population. That's quite a lot, that would like to join Eurasian Union. So in order to have more people voting for EU vector and less people supporting the orientation towards Russia, we need to show the clear examples of how Moldova can benefit from a European integration. And I'm sorry, but this is again about economic and social benefits, as well as improving the situation of the poorest parts of the Moldovan population.
Thanks, Dennis. Laura, I want to come to you now to kind of outline the situation in Georgia. Is it similarly quite polarized, and how much are economic and social issues playing into how voters are thinking about this election?
No, it's a really interesting to hear about Moldova. I think it's a little bit different in Georgia, but also a lot the same. I mean, in Georgia, you have, I think, greater numbers of support for the EU and NATO. If you look at the top line, it's, in the high 70s most of the time. And you certainly don't have a lot of love for Russia. Like I used to do with NDI, we did political polling, and we also did focus groups, and it consistently showed that. Now, where I think there's a lot in common is the fact that if you ask Georgians what are the top 10 most important issues on their mind, foreign policy does not come up. And that shouldn't surprise any of us. It doesn't come up in, we just had a vice presidential debate and Ukraine wasn't mentioned. So people don't vote on foreign policy, they vote on the economy. And in Georgia, like anywhere else, the top issues are jobs and trade and agriculture. And so I think a lot of it is also a communications issue, like what are the benefits of the EU? And the benefits of NATO, for example. And I think there's been some clumsiness around making that communication. You've got Russian disinformation coming in there and making a very heartfelt, like, this is about your culture, this is about your dignity, this is about your, autonomy. And then you've got, a NATO 10-point fact sheet. And it's not compelling. And I don't know if we've been effective enough at saying why membership in the EU is beneficial to your pocketbook, to your values, to your democracy. Some have done a good job, but we could do better. I think the other thing to understand is that, a lot of this is short-term versus long-term. And what I used to get struck by in focus groups with people around the country in Georgia was, it's like, I can sell my garbage to Russia tomorrow. I have to go through all these procedures so that I can sell my hazelnuts in the EU. And I know I'll get more money, but that's in a long time and I got to get rid of it. So there's a short-term, long-term thing here and how to offset those costs to get in compliance. And the other thing that I think is really important is, with regard to EU and NATO, when we would dig a little bit deeper, yes, I believe Georgia should join the EU. Okay. But we would also test whether they believed certain information about the EU. And we would find large numbers of Georgians wanted to join the EU, but also believed that the EU would erode Georgia's traditional culture. Want to join NATO, but also believe that NATO threatens the Orthodox Church. So those disinformation messages, both domestic and Kremlin-oriented, were seeping in. And so when the Georgian Dream government is pitching this, we can join the EU with dignity, So we can join it on our terms. We can pass that anti-LGBTQ legislation and still get into the EU. We can continue to serve as a sanctions evasion route to Russia and still get into the EU. This is not true. There are certain compliances that Georgia needs to make, because the last thing the EU wants is another Viktor Orban. But that does, I can see how that would be effective with Georgians. And I'll end here. I do think, having just been in the country and met with all the opposition parties, yeah, they mentioned economy a little bit, but I think what I was hearing from them was all Georgians will view this election as a choice between Russia and the West. And then when I met with pollsters, and I met with people that do public opinion, and I met with people that are out in the regions, they were like, I'm not sure that's how all Georgians are going to the polls. So I just think, and that's a dichotomy we see in a lot of countries, the rural-urban divide, elites in the city versus farmers in the country. I mean, they're viewing the election maybe through a different lens.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But Laura, just to stick with you for a second, I mean, so you've laid out the stakes very well for why this election matters. Obviously, Moscow and the Kremlin understands the stakes. Can you just talk to us about observations on how Russia is trying to tip the scales in its favor? I mean, you mentioned, which is interesting, that in Georgia, there's not a lot of love for Russia. And yet, so is this a top-down thing? Is it that Russia, I mean, I don't know. It's a little bit of a scattered question, but talk to us a little bit about the tools, tactics, approaches that you think that the Kremlin is using to try to increase its influence and maybe safeguard this trajectory that they're seeing from the Georgian Dream government.
Yes, I think, okay, so Russia's main tool, they've done a little bit of what they've done in Moldova, not to the extent of purchasing political parties and figures.
We're going to come to you on that next, Dennis.
Yeah, I mean, that hasn't happened to the scale. They certainly did support different movements in Georgia, different like far right authoritarian movements in Georgia, and perhaps there's some evidence that they supported some smaller pro-Russian parties, but mostly I think their effectiveness is on the information campaign, and that's always been the case. So I just as a concrete example of this, when I first moved there wasn't a lot of discourse around LGBTQ issues, and it was already illegal to have same-sex marriage, for example. And then there was an influx of information, disinformation around this issue, a real like driving up this emotion around this issue that was pretty dormant. And there was no demands for same-sex marriage. It was just sort of whatever. And it was so effective that the Georgian Dream government changed the Constitution, even though it was totally unnecessary because gay marriage was already illegal, but they wanted to put it in the Constitution just to like nail in the coffin on that one. And so that's just an example of how information campaigns from the Kremlin can really move or tap into existing public opinion. There was certainly a lot to tap into. Right now, I think Russia is really in a great position in Georgia because Georgian Dream is doing a lot of their work for them, and they're just parroting each other's talking points. So, for example, one of the big ones right now is preemptively setting the stage that if the opposition wins, it's the global war party. That's, I guess, us here, fomenting a colored revolution. So you see this narrative from the Georgian Dream on billboards. Then you see it from Russian leaders, Kremlin spokespersons. So it's exactly the same. So colored revolution, GD is using this, therefore, as part of their campaign strategy. Do you want war or do you want peace? We're going to provide peace, and manipulation around the occupied territories. So there's always been this complete nonsense narrative that we can't really get too close to the West because our only way to get back the occupied territories is having this closer relationship with Russia. And now Kremlin is dropping all these breadcrumbs on this, talking about, and then Georgian Dream. So they piggyback, and then Georgian Dream is saying, we apologize. It's our fault. 2008 war is Georgia's fault. Exactly a Kremlin narrative. So I think in summary, information operations is working. They work they support one another, Georgian Dream and the Kremlin. The narratives of war versus peace are compelling to Georgians. Of course they are. They don't want violence. They don't want to be dragged into a second front, which is what they're being told. And keep in mind that the access to information in Georgia is really difficult because you have one big television station called upped that is well resourced and is out in all the regions. And then you have all these independent and opposition leaning media that are absolutely bankrupt. They don't have money. Now, everyone has social media, not everyone. When we would do polls, we would find that the older population, and by older, it's like my age and older, really don't have access to the internet. They don't use smartphones. The younger generation do. So you also have this information silo situation taking place. So they're getting inundated with threats of war. Georgian Dream, and we can come back to Ukraine. I mean, this a lot has to do with Ukraine and Georgian Dream believing that Russia's winning in Ukraine, and that narrative is puncturing through. And then the Kremlin just throws little matches on already hot tinders. So I think the work that they have to do in other countries might be a little bit more difficult than Georgia.
Really quick follow-up, Dennis, and then come to you on this question on Russian approaches to Moldova. But I mean, you were touching on this here at the end. What would you say is Georgia Dream's affinity for Russia? Is it actually like that they want, you mentioned maybe they see that Russia's on the right side of the war, that things are, with Orban and others, that things are moving in this direction? Or is this just Georgian Dream wanting to maintain its iron grip on power, and therefore they see things like the Foreign Agents Law and other, having these narratives about color revolution and, fifth pillar within society, othering as an effective way to safeguard their own power? Is it kind of brass knuckles power calculus, or is there something more attractive from the Georgian Dream's perspective?
Well, on the attractive issue, where do they send their kids to school? I think one of the most telling things in any country that you work in about what they really think, where do they send their kids to study? Is it Iran? Is it Russia? Or is it the United States and the EU?
So maybe attractive isn't the right word, but where momentum is moving. Like, do they think that they're going to be on the right side by more closely aligning with Russia?
Okay. No, I think it's a really good question. And I think there's a lot of disagreement about what are the motivations here. I fall into the camp of what you alluded to, which is, in order to get into the EU, we've got to do these democratic reforms. If we do these democratic reforms, we might not win. And I think in a country like Georgia, unfortunately, winning elections are zero sum. It's you lose and you're in exile or you're in prison. There isn't a gracious way of losing and setting up a think tank and hanging out. Bidzina, in particular, Bidzina Ivanishvili, it's existential to him. Like he and other people will say, no. Bidzina Ivanishvili is a long-term game that the Kremlin has played. He's been a plant from the beginning. The entire aim was this long game. He was always pro-Russian. I'm a little bit more in the camp of Bidzina Ivanishvili is pro-Bidzina Ivanishvili. And when it serves him and his interests and then it's I'll go to the West, but now I'm seeing my bank accounts being frozen by Credit Suisse and all these pesky reforms that might make me leave the country because the UNM is going to come back. So I do believe it is really about maintaining power. I also believe that there might be a false sense that they really can have their cake and eat it too with this EU with dignity. But ultimately, I do think it's about maintaining power and Russia. And like in other countries I've worked in, they don't demand human rights and democracy. It's an easier relationship. So I do ultimately, at the end of the day, think it's about the democratic reforms.
Yeah, really helpful. So Dennis, over to you. So we heard GD is making life somewhat easy for the Kremlin, doing some of the hard work for it. Maya Sandu is not. And she has charted a very different course. It's top down, heading in a very different direction. So how would you describe for listeners kind of the tools, tactics, approaches that Russia is taking to try to reverse that course? Or, what are they doing in Georgia to try to maintain influence where they might worry it's on the decline?
Well, I would focus on two main aspects. The first one is about proxies. And I think that Laura has alluded to this. So yes, Moldova has a variety or a number of political parties and political leaders that are closely linked to the Kremlin, and this is the main one is Ilan Shor, who is a fugitive. He is operating from Moscow. He has given all the infrastructure possible and probably impossible, because we speak about money, but we also speak about interviews with Russian propaganda channels and other ways of projecting relevance and importance to the public in Moldova. And not only, it's about the creation of a sort of rebel that is fighting against the pro-EU government or pro-Western government controlled by the Western capitals, that is not deciding anything on its own. So this is kind of the picture that Russia is trying to create using this very efficient, I would say, politician who is fugitive in Moscow, in order to also promote different projects, political projects in Moldova. We have a platform which was created by Shor with the support of Moscow, obviously, in Moscow, which is called Victory Bloc. And this Victory Bloc has at least 5 political parties that we know about, which are very efficient and very active in Moldova. Not all of them are allowed to take part in the elections, for obvious reasons, because we speak about illegal financing. And this is something that also the US and the EU has been trying to help Moldova by sanctioning all these channels, but they're still managing to operate, to smuggle money into the country, including using the Transnistrian region and these banking transfer payments and banking sector in general, including crypto and other ways to actually pay their activity, making that possible in Moldova. So this would be about the proxies. But obviously, we also have the narratives, which are somehow very similar to what we see in Georgia. But interestingly, Moldova and Moldovan politicians, those who are actively supporting Russia, and those who have somehow stepped one step back in order not to make them vulnerable to Western sanctions as well, but also measures that can be adopted by the government in order to curtail the malign influence of Russia. So all these forms of types of politicians that are openly or hiddenly supporting Russia, strategic relationship with Russia, they speak about the Georgian model of operating, of actually being in dialogue with the West, so that you have to follow what Georgians are doing, because they are exactly not giving in their sovereignty. They are insisting on traditional values. They are against LGBT, as well as they try to build a pragmatic relationship with Russia, which allows the country to have an economic growth. So all these types of narratives, they are very fertile. I mean, they have a fertile soil in Moldova, and I think that exactly that's why Russia is so efficient in Moldova, or more efficient in Moldova than in Georgia, because it operates through proxies, as well as it has, as I mentioned, a very large category of Moldovans that are poor and that can be easily manipulated, because they are socially vulnerable people, and they don't have time to rationalize the messages that are received, and they have very little time to decide, because in a way it's like right now or never. So this kind of existential elections, that's how they are portrayed in Moldova. And not only, it's also used by the pro-Russian proxies in Moldova. So if Maya Sandu is reelected, then it will mean that not only the country will delegate even more sovereignty, will lose its sovereignty in relationship with the EU and the West in general, but it also will mean that all those who voice different opinions, they will be shut down. So it's kind of like making it very existential to the level that you have to decide that, because if not, then you'll not be able to be yourself and to speak for yourself during the parliamentary elections.
Yeah, one quick follow-up and then Nick, over to you, which is, Dennis, talk to us a little bit about like some of the rhetoric coming from the Kremlin, but also, you know, like in what ways you see or maybe don't see echoes of the types of rhetoric that Kremlin was using in the run-up to the war in Ukraine. I'm also thinking specifically of like the Gagauzia and their request for protection from Moscow and other things. Just to kind of, you know, how concerned are Moldovans that many of the precursors, the rhetoric, some of these early actions resemble things that we've seen prior to the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, the main, obviously, the fertile soil is exactly in the regions that you mentioned. You know, it's about the Gagauzien autonomy, it's about Transnistrian region, because exactly from these regions is coming this request for protection from Russia. We have seen what the Transnistrian local elected deputies have done this spring. They have asked for this support, and we know very well that the leadership of Gagauzien autonomy is frequently visiting Moscow, and we speak about Evgenia Gutsul. She's very close to shore. She's actively involved in promoting certain narratives, as well as showing that they are under the pressure of Chisinau, and that their rights are not respected. They are somehow limited in what they can do. So all of that is somehow lying in this. The rights of Russian-speaking minority, right? This is exactly what Russia has been using in Ukraine and against Ukraine, and this is somehow also resurfacing in Moldova. But apart from that, what we can also see is that we have a very intense discussion about not transforming Moldova into a second front. And here I think there is also a parallel that we can draw with Georgia. This is a very frequent topic. Don't vote for Maya Sandu, because she is trying to militarize Moldova through improving the capabilities of the Moldovan army, and that will be somehow opening or giving the Russians the right to strike against Moldova, because Moldova is getting too close to NATO, and because European integration likens more the approaching towards NATO, because the EU is also investing in its defense capacity. So we have kind of an amalgamation of these topics that makes NATO look like the EU and the other way around, and somehow creating this suspiciousness about in general about the correctness to move towards the EU, because the EU will mean also the lack of neutrality, the lose of the neutrality status for Moldova.
Nick, I'm going to throw it to you, but really quick, I want to remind Brussels Sprouts listeners who are joining us live, one of the fun things when we do these episodes with a live audience is you all have the ability to ask a question. So as you can see here, if you want to ask a question, you can use the hashtag CNAS 2024, or perhaps most easy, the chat box here to submit your question. And if you want us to identify you with your question on our Brussels Sprouts podcast, then please include your name and affiliation, and that would be great. But otherwise, we can also work to weave some of those questions through our discussion. But Nick, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. So, we've been talking a lot about what Russia has been up to in both of these countries recently and ahead of the elections. But I want to hear a little bit more from both of you about what you're worried about in terms of potential risks following these elections, depending on their outcomes. If for instance, the elections don't go the way that Russia wants, could we see Moscow really stepping up its destabilization tactics? Could we see big protests? What kind of worries you about the aftermath of these elections that we should be on the lookout for? So why don't we start with Laura on that one, and then we'll go to you, Dennis.
Great. No, thank you. I have a lot of worries about the post-election environment, no matter how it turns out, to be honest. And there's several different scenarios. So you could have a scenario where, let's say, Georgian Dream wins, and election observer groups deem that the election met basic standards. Now, look, I think right now we can say that they're not perfectly free and fair right now, because we've seen the interference that's taken place. The pre-election environment is as important as what happens on election day. But let's presume election day goes smoothly. We don't see, crazy problems or violence or whatnot. Okay, so Georgian Dream wins. I am not entirely convinced that it ends there. First of all, it certainly doesn't end there with regard to policy and the trajectory that Georgian Dream government is on, and our concerns about Georgia. But even internally, I do think that there would be protests. I think a lot of people have already, for good reason, said, no, these elections can't be free or fair because of X, Y, and Z. We're going to hit the streets. Then I worry we're going to see what happened in the spring. A retaliation, a hard crackdown on protest. Okay, so bad outcome in terms of instability. And then if they get through that period in Georgian Dream, I think we'll just move on the trajectory it's on, heading into Azerbaijani territory. And we are going to have to think about, from the United States point of view, is this a partner we want? And it's a legitimate question. We have partnerships with a lot of autocratic regimes for various reasons. So my question is, what's the value of this partnership? To me, Georgia's greatest value is its democracy. And without that, I don't know that it's a trustworthy partner, not for anything. I wouldn't want to share information with them, or intelligence, right, on anti-terrorism initiatives if they have such a close link to Kremlin. Okay, another possibility is that the opposition, maybe no one opposition bloc wins. It's impossible that they'll win an outright majority, but the four key opposition blocs together represent a majority. And a lot of people I've met with, Georgians that I respect and know more about Georgia than I do, are like, it's okay, Georgian Dream will concede. I am not convinced of that. And maybe it's just my spidey sense. And I just, as I said before, I just think Georgian Dream has so much to lose in this, and Bidzina Ivanishvili in particular. And so my guess is that's why they are preemptively putting out this narrative of the colored revolution. And on your point of destabilization from Russia, Russia's already said, we are going to help Georgian Dream in that outcome. I don't know what help means. I mean, there's some accusations, there's some speculation, and people I trust that say that Russians were already present during those protests behind Susi and some of the black RoboCops that they sent out to beat people up. I don't know, but certainly it's in Russia's interest to see a great destabilization, and it's certainly in Russia's interest to make sure that Georgian Dream win. So I do anticipate that outcome being potentially very dangerous and unsettling. So, and then there's Georgian Dream winning, but with massive irregularities, in which case we're also going to see a protest to that, and a decision from the United States and EU allies as what do we do about these elections. My advice to the international community is we listen to those domestic observers. So far, it seems like they're going to be allowed to observe, carry out their parallel vote tabulations, and conduct their work. We need to stand behind them. And they're the ones who are going to call the balls and the strikes here. So it's going to be very important that they're allowed to do their job, and very important what they say afterwards.
I have a comment and a question. On the comment, Laura, I agree with you on I don't think GD would concede an election that they lose. And the reason that I say that, and knowing much less about the Georgian government than you do, is from the comparative work in a book that we just had come out on the origins of elected strongmen, where we look at these personalist democracies, of which Georgian Dream is. The GD under Ivanishvili falls squarely in the category of these personalist regimes. And we found that when they lose elections, those elections have a high correlation to election violence. And so there's examples obviously here from the United States. So the Republican Party under Trump was more personalist than anything we've had in the past. Brazil with Bolsonaro when he lost. So I think you have very good reason to be skeptical of that. So that's the question or the comment. The question is also maybe asking you to tease out a little bit more the trajectory of the regime and asking specifically, if I'm remembering this right, didn't someone within the Georgian Dream government say that if they win the election, they will ban opposition parties? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, first of all, I love your analysis about personalistic leaders and also the permission structure that's been widely crashed open, that I lost, therefore it was stolen, has become apparently okay to do, and the violence that ensues from that. And we see Venezuela too here, and Georgians are looking very closely at Venezuela and what's sort of happened there. With regard to the other promises Georgian Dream has made in terms of moving along the trajectory of illiberalism and anti-democratic leadership, they have said indeed that they would ban the opposition. And I got clarity on that because they said the broader UNM, and United National Movement, UNM, is the former government. But what they mean by broader UNM is literally everyone. I mean, it's everyone. It's the president. It's all the NGOs. So it would be a full ban on all the opposition as we know it. I mean, maybe there are a couple pro-Russian opposition parties. It wouldn't be broader UNM. They also promised Nuremberg trials of their critics. So as I understand it, for them to ban the opposition parties, they would have to have a constitutional majority. I don't think they're going to get a constitutional majority. But nevertheless, it indicates the direction that they're going to go in. And I think we can anticipate widespread arrests, detentions of different opposition leaders or NGO leaders, either under the Foreign Agents Law or they don't need that. That's what was sort of funny about, not funny, but Transparency International and the Anti-Corruption Bureau. They have other tools at their disposal. We were all looking at the Foreign Agents Law, and then they were like, look, we're going to use the Anti-Corruption Bureau. They've since backpedaled on that. But I think that we can anticipate that it will become a lot more difficult for opposition parties to operate, and possibly a real tightening around civil society so that they're unable to operate either.
Great. Okay, Dennis, over to you.
Well, I think that Russia has a big homework in a way to do in Moldova, because it has to deal with the elections as well as the referendum. So, and the elections most likely will have 2 rounds. So it's a little bit of more complexity than what we will see in Georgia. But what I expect, of course, there will be some attempts to organize protests. We already see now some attempts to bribe participants of the protest. And more interestingly, the protests are also taking part among the diaspora in certain capitals in Europe. So we have seen in one in Paris and another one in Belgium. Then it's also somebody organized protests, small protests by the diaspora representatives in the UK. So there is a variety of ways how Russia tries to influence the the dynamic of the elections. But in my view, there will not be a large political violence after the first round of the elections. My perception is that we will have 2 rounds, and most likely Russia is learning from these presidential elections in order to prepare itself for the parliamentary elections. As we mentioned already, that the key elections for Russia is what will happen next year. But obviously, they would like to win the presidential office already in this attempt. So I'm pretty sure that we will see some attempts, but the authorities have been very much prepared to counter any sort of protest. We have not seen big protests in Chisinau since over the last 2 years, and there is an understanding that Russia can operate and also a collaboration with the Western intelligence in order to prevent this from happening.
Thanks, Dennis. It looks like we have a question from Jasmine in the audience, which is, what can the West do to reach out to citizens in these countries who may be sympathetic to Russian messaging? And this is a great question. I also just want to broaden it a little bit for general recommendations about what the United States and its partners in Europe, the European Union, individual nations in Europe, etc., should be doing, what are the actions that could still be taken to positively influence events both in Georgia and Moldova? And let's start with you, Laura.
And maybe maybe it's more so, actually, this is more for Dennis, because there have been some positive steps, right? Like the French government with things in Moldova, also Armenia, so that's a different thing. But again, and just to remind people also of the stakes and some of the important points that you made at the beginning, Laura, of why Georgia matters. If we get Georgia wrong, it's going to make doing Armenia all but impossible, I think. And you made the points about Black Sea security. I mean, there's just so many reasons why this is an important moment. And I guess, and this is just to frame your recommendations piece. What Nick and I wrote in our paper too is there's a lot of challenges here, but there is a tremendous opportunity as Russia is preoccupied and focused on its war in Ukraine, lacks perhaps some of the bandwidth and capacity to be doing all of the things that it historically has done. Are there ways that we can lean in this moment to try to put these countries on more solid footing for the future?
Woo, hard questions. No, that's great.
Solve all the problems.
I'm going to do it right now in 2 minutes. No. Well, I think one of the things that is sort of a broader takeaway from Georgia is we collective West, EU, United States, we're always taking our shoes off at the airport. We're always thinking about a problem that happened, and we're not very prescient or preemptive. And it's led to a foreign policy, and I would say a democracy foreign aid strategy that's about putting out fires and not seeing early warning signs. And what irritates me a little bit about Georgia is that there were those of us there years ago saying, Mayday, Mayday, we're seeing the signs. And no one wants to listen to it because they're like, Georgia's our democracy, darling. Don't tell us about that. And so we're making this mistake over and over. And so one of the things I think to learn from Georgia is and I think we talked about this on a previous podcast, is there's no funding, for example, for democracy and civil society in the Balkans. And we're just we don't have the bandwidth. We can't walk and chew gum at the same time. And we need to walk and chew gum at the same time. So in terms of opportunities, I think one thing that Georgians have done quite well, and it's sort of to the question, how do you reach people that are susceptible to these narratives? I think that's a question in general to backsliding democracies, including our own, is that we have a little bit of a demand problem. And we have publics and citizens that are more and more interested in illiberal strongmen as leaders. And I know, Andrea, you write about this, and it's extremely important. So we need to invest heavily in those civil society efforts that are doing that preemptive diplomacy and making the case. And I've seen good examples in Georgia where it's hey, wait a minute. I'm going to preempt all this Russian nonsense about tradition and culture. Our culture is one of acceptance. We have the oldest synagogues in the region. We had suffrage for women before the Europeans did. We are an old democracy. That was interrupted in the 1920s, et cetera. But these are our values. We are the host. We believe in multiculturalism. We believe in democracy, and we always have. And really take back the language of religion and faith and culture and tradition. And we actually did testing on this when I was in Georgia, where we used our poll to do control and treatment groups, and just feeding Georgians positive stories about and truthful stories about Russia and Europe. Oh, did you know that domestic violence in Russia is this percentage, and in Europe it's this percentage? Did you know life expectancy in Europe is this? And in Russia, did you know church attendance in the US is 10 times higher than church attendance? And even these little truthful statements kind of move the needle. So I'm a big believer in of course, investing in civil society. And when you ask what can we do, we need to be investing in those groups that are on the ground in those countries, preemptively putting out information like this and picking the right messengers. So not, young hipster from Tbilisi going to lecture people in, outside Batumi about the values of EU and NATO. No, we need like local messengers. We need local heroes. We need local church leaders. And that is really something worthy of investment. And I think that's something that is an opportunity that we can be passing on to other countries that haven't maybe fallen as far behind as Georgia, because you're right, Andrea, it's going to come. I mean, this is the trend all across the world right now. So, we need to be thinking ahead of the game and look at those early warning signs in other places.
Yeah. And then Dennis, you have 4 minutes to solve it, but I just want to quickly say, Laura, like you were shouting, watching things on the ground in terms of early warning. And in this new book that we did on the origins of elected strongmen, we say that where you see a leader brought into office with the backing of a personalist party, so Ivanishvili and the Georgian Dream, democracy is at risk. And I understand that resources are constrained, but that's the early warning sign. Like when these leaders and these personalist parties come to power, that's the way that we should prioritize limited resources. And so it was there from the moment of the election, and you were seeing the earliest phases of it. And there's more that could be done. So in the spirit of more that can be done to keep things going on the right track, Dennis, what recommendations would you have for the United States and Europe in terms of how best to support Moldova and its westward trajectory?
Well, I would go for out-of-the-box methods. I think that we are underestimating the population in these two countries, in Moldova particularly. We have to understand that critically thinking and critically assessing the political reality in the country is super important. So civil society organizations or media outlets that are promoting democracy and democratic values should somehow, educate the population in order to think critically about any political party, as well the party that is ruling the country, because we are creating this kind of lack of confidence when we sell them a reality they don't live in. And that should be something that we understand and take care of. And the other element, which I think will play a big role in kind of creating this safety nets, is to create collaboration between like-minded political parties. It's unacceptable when political parties that are ruling the country are cannibalizing on other political forces that are also pro-EU or pro-NATO. We have to see a collaboration and a common sense of urgency when it comes to European integration, when it comes to other priorities that are important for Moldova and Georgia.
Okay, this was an excellent conversation. I will just put in a final plug for the policy memo that Nick and I just put out on exploiting Russian weakness, leaning in to support the pro-Western orientation of Moldova and Georgia. We cover many of these issues, but also have a host of other recommendations that we think would have some impact in putting both of these countries on better footing moving forward. So, but with that, Laura and Dennis, thank you so much for joining us. This was really a great conversation, and so glad that you guys could help us shine a light on, I think, what is a really important October for the South Caucasus region. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.